Dearest listeners, it is a truth universally acknowledged that the heart knows not the boundaries of propriety, nor does it respect the sacred bonds of friendship when Cupid's arrow strikes true. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most scandalous yet tender tale of a love that bloomed in the shadow of brotherly protection, where innocence met experience, and where a single glance across a crowded ballroom changed the course of two souls forever intertwined. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. And before we plunge into this delicious scandal, I ask of you a small favor, my dear listeners. If you, like myself, are captivated by tales of forbidden passions and love that defies convention, do show your appreciation with a like upon this chronicle. Ensure you are subscribed, that you might not miss a single whisper or secret from high society. And naturally, I long to read your comments below. Tell me, do you believe that such overwhelming love justifies the breaking of a sacred promise between friends? Now, without further ado, let us enter the ballrooms of Mayfair. The morning sun cast long shadows across the elegant townhouse in Grosvenor Square as Miss Penelope St. Fair stood before her looking-glass, her delicate fingers trembling ever so slightly as they smoothed the pristine white muslin of her debut gown. At 18 years of age, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes as clear as a summer sky, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that poets might spend lifetimes attempting to capture in verse. Yet for all her loveliness, there existed within her countenance a certain hesitancy, as though she were a butterfly still uncertain of its wings. The household had been in a state of controlled chaos for weeks in preparation for this momentous evening. Her mother, Lady Margaret St. Fair, had overseen every detail with the precision of a military commander, from the selection of the modiste to the arrangement of pearls in Penelope's hair. Her father, Lord Edmund St. Fair, maintained his usual air of benevolent detachment, offering occasional words of encouragement whilst primarily concerning himself with the management of his extensive library and correspondence. Most notably absent from these preparations was Lord Henry St. Fair, Penelope's elder brother by 12 years, whose protective nature had cast a long shadow over her childhood and youth. At 30 years of age, Henry had assumed the role of patriarch with perhaps excessive enthusiasm following their father's gradual retreat from society. His absence, necessitated by urgent matters at their Yorkshire estates, had created an unexpected atmosphere of liberation within the household, though none would dare voice such a sentiment aloud. Penelope had spent her youth in the peculiar isolation that befalls the much younger sister of a formidable brother, while other young ladies of her acquaintance had enjoyed the freedoms of friendship and gentle flirtations under the watchful but permissive eyes of their families. She had existed within the gilded cage of Henry's vigilant affection. Every potential friend had been scrutinized, every invitation carefully vetted, every dance partner at informal gatherings subjected to Henry's penetrating stare. It was not that he was unkind. Indeed, his devotion to his sister bordered on the reverential, but rather that he seemed incapable of perceiving her as anything other than the golden-haired child who had once followed him about the gardens, demanding stories of knights and dragons. The irony, which Penelope understood with the clarity that comes from years of observation, was that Henry's very efforts to shield her from the world had left her particularly unprepared for it. While other debutantes approached their first season armed with the subtle arts of flirtation, learned through years of country dances and house parties, Penelope possessed only her books, her music, and her own uncertain instincts. She had found solace in the pages of novels, though she was careful to conceal the more romantic volumes from Henry's disapproving gaze. The poetry of Byron, which she read in secret in the conservatory, had awakened in her something more than mere curiosity. She read the passionate verses not as mere fiction, but as a map to a world of feelings that she sensed existed, somewhere, waiting for her. The passionate sonatas she played upon the pianoforte when the house was empty seemed to speak of emotions she had never experienced, but somehow understood in the depths of her soul. As her lady's maid, Sarah, made the final adjustments to her ensemble, Penelope contemplated the evening ahead with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Almac's assembly rooms, that hallowed temple of the ton where reputations were made and destroyed with equal swiftness, awaited her debut. The patronesses, those formidable arbiters of social acceptance, would scrutinize her every movement, every word, every gesture. One false step, one breach of the elaborate protocols that governed their world, and she might find herself relegated to the periphery of society before her season had truly begun. Yet beneath her trepidation stirred something else, a curious excitement, a sense that perhaps tonight marked not merely her entrance into society, but the beginning of something far more significant. She thought of the other young ladies who would make their debuts alongside her: Miss Charity Weatherby with her infectious laugh, Lady Emma Fairweather with her sharp wit, Miss Augusta Merriweather with her extensive fortune. Each would enter that ballroom armed with their own hopes and ambitions, their own dreams of conquest and romance. Lady Margaret entered the chamber, resplendent in purple silk that complemented her still handsome features. She surveyed her daughter with the critical eye of a mother who had successfully navigated 3 seasons before securing her own advantageous match. Her pronouncement that Penelope looked exquisite came with the underlying message that this was merely the minimum acceptable standard. The instructions that followed were precise and exhaustive. One must be accomplished enough to intrigue, modest enough to charm, and clever enough to engage without appearing threatening to the gentleman's intellectual vanity. Penelope nodded dutifully at her mother's guidance, though privately she wondered at the exhausting performance required of young ladies. How much simpler it would be, she thought, to simply be oneself and trust that the right person would appreciate such authenticity. But such revolutionary thoughts were best kept private, particularly from a mother who had spent the better part of 2 months drilling her in the intricate choreography of social success. The carriage ride to Almack's seemed both endless and all too brief. As they approached King Street, Penelope could see the glow of countless candles through the windows, could hear the faint strains of music floating on the evening air. Her destiny awaited within those hallowed walls, though she could not have imagined how dramatically her life was about to change. The crush at Almack's was precisely as overwhelming as Penelope had anticipated. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of perfume, pomade, and the underlying tension of hundreds of individuals, each pursuing their own social agendas. The orchestra played with mechanical precision, their notes floating above the din of conversation and the rustle of silk against silk. Candlelight from the massive chandeliers cast everything in a golden glow that seemed to blur the edges of reality, transforming the assembly rooms into something from a fairy tale. Penelope stood near a marble column, her dance card dangling from her gloved wrist, still pristine and unmarked. Her mother had been claimed by Lady Jersey for what appeared to be an intense discussion about some matter of social import, leaving Penelope momentarily adrift in the sea of unfamiliar faces. She recognized some from morning calls and park promenades, but the formal setting transformed even familiar acquaintances into strangers. It was then, as she attempted to appear both approachable and properly aloof, a balance she had not quite mastered, that she saw him. George Thornwell, Visconde de Ashcroft, stood across the ballroom engaged in conversation with Lord Weatherby, his dark head bent slightly as he listened with apparent interest to the older man's discourse. She had known George, in a manner of speaking, for the better part of 10 years. He had been Henry's particular friend since their days at Oxford, a constant presence at family dinners and holiday gatherings. Yet she had never truly seen him until this moment. Perhaps it was the formal evening attire that transformed him, the way the black coat emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the elegant line of his bearing. Perhaps it was the way the candlelight caught the amber notes in his eyes she had never noticed were quite that remarkable shade. Or perhaps it was simply that she was seeing him for the first time, not as her brother's friend, but as a man, devastatingly handsome, sophisticated, and utterly unaware of her existence. George, for his part, had attended the evening's festivities out of a sense of duty rather than enthusiasm. At 27, he had successfully evaded the matrimonial ambitions of numerous matchmaking mamas, maintaining his bachelor status through a combination of charm, discretion, and strategic absence during the height of previous seasons. His presence tonight owed more to his position in society and a promise to his own mother to at least make an appearance at the season's opening ball. He had been half listening to Weatherby's detailed account of a particularly profitable investment opportunity when something, he could never afterwards explain what, compelled him to glance across the ballroom. His gaze fell upon a vision in white muslin, and for a moment his world tilted on its axis. He interrupted his own sentence mid-word, completely forgetting what Lord Weatherby had been saying. The young woman standing by the column was not merely beautiful, she was a revelation, a perfect musical note that silenced all else in the ballroom. There was something about the way she held herself, a combination of uncertainty and inherent grace, that spoke to something deep within him. It took him several seconds to realize that this enchanting creature was none other than Penelope St. Fair. Little Penny, as Henry had always called her, though George noted with sudden clarity that there was nothing little about her now. When had she transformed from the shy child who had hidden behind doors to eavesdrop on their conversations into this stunning woman who made his pulse quicken from across a crowded room? Their eyes met across the expanse of dancers and observers, and the world seemed to pause in its rotation. Penelope felt a flush rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the warmth of the room. George's gaze held hers for a moment that stretched into eternity, and in that look she read surprise, admiration, and something else, something that made her heart flutter in a most alarming manner. The moment was broken by Lord Weatherby's hand on George's shoulder, demanding his attention for some point of particular importance. George turned away reluctantly, but Penelope observed that his gaze returned to her repeatedly over the next several minutes, as though he could not quite believe what he was seeing. Lady Margaret materialized at Penelope's elbow with the efficiency of a general deploying troops, announcing Lord Cunningham's imminent approach for an introduction. But Penelope barely registered her mother's words. Her entire being was focused on the tall figure now making his way through the crowd with purposeful strides. George approached with the confidence of a man who had navigated these social waters for years, yet there was something different in his manner. A tension, an anticipation that betrayed his usual sang-froid. He bowed correctly before Lady Margaret, his smile warm but respectful as he expressed hope that they were enjoying the evening's festivities. Lady Margaret's response was notably warmer than it might have been for other gentlemen. George's long friendship with Henry had earned him a certain favored status, though she had never considered him as a potential suitor for Penelope. She mentioned Henry's absence on estate business, and George smoothly replied that he had promised to ensure Miss St. Fair's debut was not lacking in familiar faces, though this was a complete fabrication. Henry had made no such request, being entirely absorbed in drainage disputes and tenant concerns. When George's gaze shifted to Penelope and he requested the honor of a dance, his voice softened perceptibly. Penelope's acceptance came out as barely more than a whisper, but George heard it clearly enough. As he inscribed his name on her dance card, the first name to grace that pristine surface, she noticed that his hand trembled ever so slightly. It was a small thing, barely perceptible, but it suggested that perhaps she was not the only one affected by this unexpected shift in their dynamic. The dance was a cotillion, its figures allowing for moments of proximity, followed by separation that seemed to mirror the push and pull of their newfound awareness of each other. As they moved through the patterns with practiced grace, George found himself uncharacteristically searching for appropriate conversation. This was Penelope, whom he had known since she was 8 years old, who had once spilled raspberry cordial on his new boots and cried for an hour despite his assurances that it mattered not in the slightest. Yet as she moved through the dance with natural elegance, her eyes bright with an intelligence he had somehow never noticed, He felt as though he were meeting her for the first time. He complimented her dancing, wincing internally at the banality of the observation. Her response surprised him with its gentle teasing. Did he expect her to tread upon his toes as she had when she was 12? George was oddly touched that she recalled what he had assumed was a forgettable incident from a Christmas house party years ago. When she confessed that she remembered everything, speaking softly with a depth to her gaze that suggested layers he had never suspected, he found himself captivated entirely. As the dance ended and George reluctantly returned Penelope to her mother's side, neither could have predicted how that single cotillion would alter the course of their lives. But somewhere in the shadows of the assembly rooms, fate was already weaving its intricate web. The weeks following that first dance unfolded with the measured pace of a carefully orchestrated symphony. George found himself calling at Grosvenor Square with increasing frequency, always with perfectly acceptable reasons that would raise no eyebrows. He came to discuss business matters with Lord Edmund, to deliver books he thought Lady Margaret might enjoy, volumes of poetry that he knew perfectly well would find their way to Penelope's eager hands, and to share news from Henry's letters, though in truth, Henry's correspondence had been remarkably sparse and mundane. Society began to take notice of Lord Ashcroft's particular attention to the youngest Saint Fair. The morning calls, which propriety dictated should last no more than 15 minutes, somehow extended to half an hour when George was present. He appeared at every event where Penelope was expected, materializing at her side with remarkable consistency during the social whirl of routs, musical evenings, and card parties. At the Fairweather musical soirée, he contrived to sit beside her during a particularly moving performance of Mozart. The proximity allowed Penelope to become intensely aware of his presence, the warmth that seemed to radiate from him, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way his fingers drummed silently against his knee in time with the music. When their hands accidentally brushed as they both reached for their programs, a tremor ran through her entire being, as though her very soul recognized his touch. George, meanwhile, found himself caught in an internal struggle that grew more intense with each passing day. More than once he took up his pen to write to Henry and confess everything, only to burn the half-formed letter before the first sentence was complete. Honesty seemed a betrayal, silence another form of treachery. His initial attraction to Penelope had deepened into something far more profound and troubling. He discovered that she possessed a sharp wit she had kept carefully hidden, revealing it only in subtle observations that made him laugh unexpectedly. She read voraciously, not just the novels considered appropriate for young ladies, but philosophy, poetry, even political treatises that she discussed with surprising insight when she felt safe from censure. During a particularly tedious evening at Lady Drummond's, where the entertainment consisted of amateur theatricals of dubious quality, he found himself seated beside Penelope in the back row. She leaned slightly toward him and whispered an observation about the playwright's extensive liberties with Shakespeare's original text, noting that Romeo was not meant to expire quite so noisily. George had to disguise his laugh as a cough, earning a disapproving look from Lady Drummond. But the shared moment of mirth created a bond between them, a sense of conspiracy against the sometimes absurd demands of their social world. Yet with Henry's absence extending into its third week, George felt the weight of his position acutely. Henry trusted him implicitly, had often spoken of his relief that George would be in London to keep an eye on things. To pursue Penelope felt like a betrayal of that trust, a violation of the unspoken code that governed male friendship. Brothers did not court sisters without explicit permission, and best friends certainly did not take advantage of a brother's absence to press their suit. He attempted to maintain appropriate distance, to treat Penelope with the same brotherly affection he had always shown, but it proved impossible. When she entered a room, his gaze sought her immediately. When she laughed, really laughed, not the polite titter expected of young ladies, something in his chest tightened with an emotion he dared not name. When other gentlemen paid her court, which they increasingly did as her beauty and charm became recognized, He felt a possessive anger that shocked him with its intensity. Lord Cunningham, in particular, seemed determined to win Penelope's favor. Heir to a considerable fortune and possessed of the kind of classical good looks that made debutantes sigh, he represented exactly the sort of match Henry would approve. George watched with barely concealed frustration as Cunningham claimed dance after dance, monopolized Penelope during interval conversations, and sent elaborate bouquets that filled the St. Fair drawing room with their cloying scent. Penelope, for her part, received Cunningham's attentions with perfect propriety, but no enthusiasm. She understood what was expected of her, to encourage appropriate suitors, to make a brilliant match that would please her family and secure her position in society. Cunningham was everything a debutante should want: handsome, wealthy, attentive, and possessed of an ancient title that would make her the envy of her peers. Yet when he held her during the waltz, she felt nothing but a vague discomfort at his proximity. His conversation, though perfectly proper, bored her. His compliments, though lavish, seemed to slide off her consciousness without leaving any impression. She found herself comparing every interaction to those precious moments with George, the way his eyes lit up when she made an astute observation, the warmth in his voice when he spoke her name, the barely perceptible tension that seemed to vibrate between them whenever they were near. It was during the Merryweather Ball, as George observed Cunningham leading Penelope into yet another waltz, that he finally acknowledged the truth to himself. He was in love with Penelope St. Fair. Not the mild affection of friendship, not the protective care owed to a friend's sister, but the kind of consuming, soul-deep love that poets wrote about and sensible men avoided. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him momentarily breathless. He watched from the edge of the ballroom as Cunningham held her perhaps a fraction closer than strict propriety allowed, saw the way the other man's gaze lingered on her face with obvious admiration. The sight filled George with a combination of jealousy and despair that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. He had no right to feel this way, no claim on Penelope's affections beyond that of an old family friend. Yet the thought of her belonging to another, of Cunningham or any other man having the right to hold her, to touch her, to call her wife, was unbearable. The afternoon was unseasonably warm for April, the kind of day that whispered promises of the summer to come. Hyde Park was crowded with the fashionable set taking advantage of the weather, their carriages creating a slow-moving parade of wealth and status. Penelope walked with her maid Sarah a discreet distance behind, having escaped the confines of the house under the pretext of requiring fresh air for a headache. She had not expected to encounter George, though perhaps she should not have been surprised when he appeared on the path ahead, clearly having abandoned his mount for a solitary walk. He was hatless, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the breeze, and there was something in his posture, a kind of restless energy, that made her pulse quicken. Their greeting was formal, proper, though both understood there was nothing coincidental about their presence in this particular section of the park at this particular hour. It was the path she always walked, the time she always chose, and he had certainly observed her patterns over the past weeks. They fell into step together, Sarah maintaining a respectful distance that allowed for private conversation whilst preserving the proprieties. For several minutes they walked in silence, but it was not the awkward silence of strangers. A charged quiet settled between them, broken only by the distant sounds of carriages and the rustling of leaves overhead. The air itself seemed to thrum with unspoken words, with feelings that pressed against the constraints of proper behavior like floodwaters against a dam. George mentioned receiving a letter from Henry that morning, though his tone suggested this was not what he truly wished to discuss. The estate matters in Yorkshire were proving more complex than anticipated, requiring at least another fortnight, possibly longer, to resolve. The news should have brought relief. More time before Henry's return would change everything, but instead it only intensified the tension between them. They had reached a more secluded part of the path, where ancient oaks created a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns. George stopped walking suddenly, turning to face her with an expression of such intensity that she felt her breath catch. He spoke of finding himself in an impossible position, of the transformation his feelings toward her had undergone that made protecting her interests increasingly difficult. Penelope understood perfectly what he meant, though she feigned confusion initially. When pressed, she admitted to feelings she did not entirely understand, how the very air seemed to change when he entered a room, how she found herself memorizing his every word, how she wished their dances would never end. George's struggle was evident in every line of his body, in the way he ran his hand through his hair in frustration, in the roughness of his voice when he insisted she deserved better than a man who betrayed his friend's trust. But Penelope would not be deterred. With sudden fire, she declared herself not a child, not some delicate object to be protected and preserved, but a woman with thoughts, feelings, and desires of her own. If her heart had made its choice, then her feelings answered to her own soul alone, not to Henry's command. The vehemence of her declaration clearly stunned George. In that moment, she was magnificent, her eyes blazing with determination, her chin lifted in defiance of convention. When he warned that Henry and society would never approve, she had a ready answer. They would be the very model of propriety in public, limiting their dances, calls, and interactions to what was strictly proper. But in private, she suggested, they might allow themselves to explore these feelings that neither seemed able to deny. George moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, and warned her that she was playing with fire. Her response, a whispered declaration that she would rather burn, undid him completely. Something in her eyes, a combination of innocence and determination, of vulnerability and strength, broke through his last defenses. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and danger. They stood at a crossroads, both understanding that the next step would irrevocably change everything. The sounds of the park faded away, leaving only the thundering of their hearts and the whispered promises of a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a mud-splattered courier who had ridden through the night from Yorkshire. The household was just beginning its daily routine when the urgent knocking disrupted the morning calm. Penelope, descending the stairs for breakfast, knew something was amiss the moment she saw her mother's expression change from mild interest to acute concern as she read Henry's missive. Lady Margaret announced with carefully controlled neutrality that Henry's business had concluded more swiftly than expected, and he would return on the morrow. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of consequence through Penelope's carefully constructed world. Tomorrow. Henry would return tomorrow, and the delicate balance she and George had maintained. Those precious stolen moments in gardens, meaningful glances across ballrooms, conversations laden with subtext that only they could interpret, would crumble under her brother's scrutinizing gaze. George received the news at his club, where a similar express had been delivered. The messenger had clearly been instructed to ensure the message reached him with all speed. Henry's letter was brief, almost curt, mentioning only that matters had been resolved and that he looked forward to resuming his place in town. But there was something in the tone, a certain formality that differed from Henry's usual casual correspondence that made George's blood run cold. Had someone written to Henry? Had news of his attention to Penelope somehow reached Yorkshire? That evening's entertainment was a grand ball at Stafford House, one of those glittering affairs where all of society gathered to see and be seen. Penelope attended with a heavy heart, uncertain whether George would appear given the news of Henry's imminent return. She wore silk the color of spring leaves, a daring choice that her mother had initially questioned but ultimately approved. The color set off her fair coloring to perfection and drew admiring glances from every corner of the ballroom, though Penelope noticed none of them. George did appear, though later than usual, and there was a tension in his bearing that communicated itself to her immediately. He claimed his customary 2 dances, but their interaction was stilted, constrained by the weight of unspoken fears and the knowledge that their time was running out. It was during the supper interval that disaster struck. Penelope had escaped to the terrace, seeking respite from the oppressive heat of the ballroom and the endless stream of vapid conversation. The cool night air was a blessing against her flushed skin, and she stood near the stone balustrade, gazing out at the darkened gardens below. Lord Cunningham found her there, and it was immediately apparent that he had been drinking more champagne than was advisable. His usually impeccable appearance was slightly disheveled, his cravat askew, and there was a belligerence in his manner that set her instantly on edge. His accusations came in a torrent, that she had been toying with him, encouraging his attention only to withdraw it. Accepting his flowers and calls while granting Lord Ashcroft privileges she denied him. Penelope attempted to maintain her composure, to explain that she had shown him nothing but the courtesy due any gentleman of her acquaintance, that any encouragement he had perceived was unintended. But Cunningham was beyond reason. He moved closer, backing her against the stone balustrade, his words becoming increasingly aggressive. He spoke of being tired of games, of women who played with men's affections. When he reached for her, whether to embrace her forcibly or merely to prevent her escape would be debated in drawing rooms for weeks afterwards, Penelope could not suppress a cry of alarm. What happened next occurred with such speed that witnesses would later give conflicting accounts. George did not shout or rush forward in blind rage. Instead, he moved with a lethal calm that was far more terrifying than any display of fury. He crossed the space between them in 2 measured strides, his hand shooting out not wildly but with precision, connecting with Cunningham's jaw in a blow that combined years of boxing practice with righteous anger. The crack of impact echoed across the terrace like a gunshot, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. Cunningham crumpled to the ground, blood streaming from his nose, while George stood over him with fists still clenched, but his breathing remarkably controlled, murder in his eyes tempered by an icy composure. George's warning to Cunningham was delivered in a voice that carried despite its quiet intensity. If he ever approached Miss St. Fair again, George would demand satisfaction in a manner that would leave him unable to approach anyone ever again. The threat was unmistakable, and the implications were clear to everyone present. A gentleman did not risk such scandal, did not issue such threats, unless his interest was deeply personal. The scandal was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, the entire ballroom buzzed with the news. Lord Ashcroft had struck Lord Cunningham in defense of Miss St. Fair's honor. Some versions of the story had Cunningham attempting to force his attentions upon her. Others suggested a long-standing rivalry between the 2 men with Penelope as merely the catalyst. The truth, as is often the case, mattered less than the perception, and the perception was damning. Penelope fled the ball with her mother, mortified by the attention and terrified of the consequences. As their carriage rattled through the London streets, she could feel her mother's disapproval radiating like heat from a forge, though Lady Margaret said nothing. The silence was worse than any lecture could have been. George, after ensuring Cunningham was removed from the premises, found himself surrounded by curious peers demanding explanations he could not provide without further compromising Penelope's reputation. He deflected their questions with cold efficiency, but he knew the damage was done. By morning, the story would be on every tongue in London, growing more elaborate with each telling. Henry arrived at his London residence at noon the next day, travel-stained and exhausted from riding through the night. He had pushed himself and his mount to the limits of endurance, driven by an urgency he could not quite name. The household was in uproar, the servants whispering in corners and falling silent when he appeared. The butler, attempting to provide a coherent account of the previous evening's events, only succeeded in stoking Henry's growing fury. George called within the hour, knowing that delay would only worsen the situation. He found Henry in the library, standing rigid with rage beside the cold fireplace. The confrontation that followed was as painful as it was inevitable. Henry's accusation came without preamble, George had been trusted to protect Penelope and instead had made her the subject of scandal. George's defense that Cunningham had been imposing upon her and that he had done what any gentleman would do rang hollow even to his own ears. Henry's response cut to the heart of the matter. Was this the action of any gentleman or of a gentleman with particular interest in the lady's favor? The silence that followed George's hesitation was damning. In that moment, Henry had his answer, and the betrayal he felt was written plainly across his face. Their decade of friendship, built on trust and mutual respect, crumbled like a castle built on sand. Henry's dismissal was cold and final. George was no longer welcome in his home, and any attempt to contact Penelope would be considered a grave breach of what little trust remained between them. The days following Henry's return were among the darkest Penelope had ever known. Her brother's fury manifested not in shouting or dramatics, but in a cold, implacable determination to protect what he saw as his sister's compromised honor. She was confined to the house, permitted only family visitors. George was explicitly banned from calling, and Henry made it clear to the household staff that any attempt at communication was to be reported to him immediately. Penelope bore her imprisonment with initial stoicism, retreating into herself like a wounded animal. She spent hours at the pianoforte, pouring her frustration and longing into Beethoven's more turbulent sonatas. The music echoed through the house like a cry of anguish, causing even the servants to exchange worried glances. She read and reread the few notes George had managed to send through her maid Sarah before Henry discovered and stopped that avenue of communication. As days turned into a week, her composure began to crack. She took her meals in her room, claiming a lack of appetite that worried her mother. The vibrant young woman who had debuted with such promise seemed to fade like a flower deprived of sunlight, growing paler and more withdrawn with each passing day. George, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle. His friendship with Henry, once one of the cornerstones of his life, lay in ruins. They had encountered each other at White's, and Henry had delivered the cut direct, turning his back on George in full view of their peers, a social snub so severe that witnesses actually gasped. The message was clear. Their decade of friendship was over, severed as cleanly as if it had never existed. Yet worse than the loss of Henry's friendship was the knowledge that Penelope was suffering. He had glimpsed her once, a pale face at an upstairs window before the curtains were hastily drawn. The sight haunted him, driving him to pace his study late into the night, searching for a solution that would not materialize. He considered a dozen plans: elopement to Gretna Green, an appeal to Lord Edmund, even challenging Henry to a duel, but each would only result in greater scandal and harm to Penelope's reputation. It was Lady Margaret, surprisingly, who proved to be the unexpected ally. A woman of considerable intelligence beneath her conventional exterior, she had observed the growing attachment between George and Penelope with more sympathy than either might have expected. She had married for position rather than love, and while the match had not been unhappy, she had always wondered what passion might feel like. Watching her daughter waste away for want of a man who was, by all objective measures, an excellent match, stirred something within her. She found Henry in his study one evening, surrounded by estate papers he was clearly not reading. His own appearance had deteriorated. Dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights, and there was a tension in his bearing that spoke of internal conflict. Lady Margaret's approach was uncharacteristically direct. She informed him bluntly that he was destroying his sister, that his protection had become a prison. Her words were carefully chosen but devastating in their accuracy. She pointed out that he was rejecting a man of excellent character and substantial fortune who clearly adored Penelope, that society would celebrate the match if not for his inexplicable opposition. Henry's defensive response, that George had betrayed his trust, was met with a gentle but firm correction. George had not betrayed anything. He had simply fallen in love. Love, Lady Margaret reminded her son, was not something one chose or controlled. She then played her most powerful card, reminding Henry of his own lost love years ago, a young woman deemed unsuitable by their father. Henry had acquiesced to paternal authority, and the young woman had married elsewhere. She was happy now, by all accounts, but Henry had never quite recovered from the loss. The parallel was too obvious to ignore. Henry was now playing the role of their father, denying Penelope her choice, just as his had been denied. Would he condemn his sister to the same lifetime of regret that he himself endured? Lady Margaret left him then, but her words lingered. Over the next days, Henry found himself truly observing his sister for the first time in years. He went to her private sitting room and found her at the window, a book open but unread in her lap. When she turned to face him, he was shocked at the change in her. The vibrant young woman who had debuted with such promise had been replaced by a wan shadow. She had lost weight, her dress hanging loosely on her frame, and the light that had always danced in her eyes had been extinguished. It was Penelope herself who finally forced the issue. She stood before him with a dignity that belied her fragile appearance and announced that she had something to say, and he would listen because despite everything, she knew he loved her. Henry nodded slowly, gesturing for her to continue, though he suspected what was coming. Penelope's words were measured but powerful. She spoke of how he saw her as a child to be protected and controlled, but she was a woman with a woman's heart and desires. George saw that, saw her not as Henry's sister or a responsibility, but as herself. Did Henry have any idea how rare that was, how precious? When he protested that George should have spoken to him first, she had a ready answer. When could he have done so? Henry had made it clear from the moment of her debut that no man would be good enough. He had scrutinized every dance partner, dismissed every caller, found fault with every potential suitor. George had known Henry would never approve, regardless of his worth or intentions. Her next words cut deep. She spoke of love that did not request permission, and then, with surgical precision, she reminded him of his own lost love. The reference hung between them, unspoken but understood. Her final ultimatum was delivered with quiet devastation. If he sent George away, she would obey. She would remain dutiful and proper. She would eventually marry someone he deemed appropriate, perhaps even Lord Cunningham despite the recent scandal. She would be a perfect society wife, hostess, and mother. But she would never forgive him. And worse, she would never be truly happy. Was Henry's pride worth her lifetime of regret? After Penelope left, Henry sat alone in the gathering darkness. He went to his desk and opened a drawer he rarely accessed, withdrawing a miniature portrait in a gold frame. The face that looked back at him was not his mother's, but that of Miss Eleanor Fairfax, now Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, mother of 3 and wife to a prosperous merchant. She had loved him once, and he her, but his father had deemed her connections insufficient, her dowry too modest. Henry had been young, only 22, and had lacked the courage to defy his father. Looking at Eleanor's portrait, remembering the pain of watching her marry another, Henry finally understood the cruelty of what he was about to inflict upon his sister. He was not protecting Penelope. He was punishing her for his own fears and regrets. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Henry stood at the window of his study the next morning, watching the rain streak down the glass in rivulets that distorted the London street beyond. He had not slept, spending the night wrestling with his pride, his protective instincts, and the growing realization that his mother and sister were right. As dawn broke, he had finally made his decision. The note he sent to George was brief, but would change everything. A summons for 2 o'clock that afternoon, signed simply with his initial. No explanation, no elaboration, just a time and the implied command to appear. George arrived precisely on time, neither early nor late, approaching Henry's study with the wariness of a man entering potentially hostile territory. The weeks of separation had taken their toll. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, a gauntness to his features that suggested missed meals and constant worry. He entered when bidden, accepting the chair Henry indicated, but maintaining a careful formality that spoke volumes about the gulf between them. Henry poured 2 glasses of brandy from the decanter on his desk, pushing one toward George, who accepted it but did not drink. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of broken friendship and unspoken accusations. When Henry finally spoke, admitting he had been a fool, blinded by his own fears and prejudices, George remained silent, waiting. Henry continued, his words carefully chosen but sincere. He spoke of the promise he had made when their father died, to protect Penelope from all harm. She had been so young, so innocent, and he had built walls around her, thinking to keep her safe. He had not realized he was also keeping her from living. The admission that followed cost Henry dearly, but he voiced it nonetheless. George had been his closest friend for 10 years, trusted with his life on more than one occasion. Yet when it came to trusting him with Penelope's heart, Henry had balked. He asked for forgiveness, though he knew he might not deserve it. George's response was quiet but heartfelt. There was nothing to forgive. Henry's protectiveness came from love, and that was understandable. But Henry needed to understand that George loved Penelope, not as a sister or responsibility, but as the remarkable woman she had become. He would die before causing her harm. Henry studied his friend's face, seeing there the same determination that had carried them through countless adventures and challenges over the years. Rising from his chair, he moved to a cabinet where he kept his most precious possessions. From it, he withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring of stunning beauty. A sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. The ring had belonged to their grandmother, always intended for Penelope's engagement. Henry could think of no better man to give it to her. The significance of the gesture was not lost on George, who stared at the ring, then at Henry, clearly struggling with emotion. Henry's blessing came with an apology. He had nearly destroyed 3 lives with his stubborn pride. A man needed his friend as much as his sister needed her happiness. The embrace that followed was brief but fierce, the kind that English gentlemen permitted themselves only in moments of extreme emotion. When they separated, both were suspiciously bright-eyed. Henry informed George that Penelope was in the music room where she had been playing the same Mozart sonata repeatedly for the past hour. She might, he suggested with a slight smile, welcome an interruption. George found her exactly as Henry had described, her fingers moving over the keys with mechanical precision while her mind was clearly elsewhere. She wore a simple morning dress of pale blue muslin, and her hair was arranged loosely, as though she had not expected visitors. To George, she had never looked more beautiful. She did not hear him enter over the music, and for a moment he simply stood watching her, overwhelmed by the depth of his feeling. Then, as though sensing his presence, she turned. The transformation in her face when she saw him was like watching the sun emerge from behind storm clouds. Joy, relief, and love illuminated her features as she rose from the piano bench and flew across the room. Propriety be damned, George thought, as he caught her in his arms, feeling her tremble against him. They had earned this moment through weeks of separation and suffering. When she whispered his name, questioned if he was really there, he assured her that Henry had given his blessing. When they finally drew apart, George dropped to one knee, producing the ring Henry had given him. His proposal was heartfelt and eloquent. She had awakened in him a fire he never knew could burn, had shown him that life without love was merely existence. Would she do him the incomparable honor of becoming his wife? Her acceptance was immediate and tearful, repeated multiple times as though she feared he might not believe a single affirmation. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, they both marveled at how perfectly it fit, as though it had been waiting all these years for this moment. The wedding took place 6 weeks later at the St. Fair family chapel in Yorkshire, surrounded by golden summer light and the perfume of roses from the ancient garden. It was a smaller affair than society might have expected, limited to family and close friends, but perfect in its intimacy. The chapel, with its Norman arches and stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the stone floor, provided a setting of timeless romance. Henry stood as George's groomsman, a position that publicly proclaimed the restoration of their friendship and his approval of the match. The gesture was not lost on the assembled guests, who whispered approvingly about the brotherly bond that had weathered such storms. Penelope walked down the aisle on her father's arm, radiant in ivory silk and her grandmother's pearls. The dress, a creation of the finest modiste in London, featured delicate embroidery of silver thread that caught the light with every movement. Her veil, an heirloom of Brussels lace, had been worn by her mother and grandmother before her. But it was her expression that drew every eye, the pure joy and love that shone from her face as she looked at George, waiting at the altar. George, resplendent in a coat of midnight blue that emphasized his broad shoulders and brought out the amber in his eyes, watched his bride approach with an expression of such naked adoration that several matrons were seen to dab at their eyes with their handkerchiefs. When Lord Edmund placed Penelope's hand in George's, the older man's voice was thick with emotion as he gave the traditional blessing. The vows were exchanged with voices that barely trembled, the ancient words taking on new meaning in their mouths. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was brief but intense, a promise of passion carefully controlled for public consumption but unmistakable in its depth. The wedding breakfast was held in the great hall of the St. Fair estate, transformed with flowers and ribbons into a bower of celebration. Toasts were offered with increasing sentiment as the champagne flowed. Lord Edmund's was brief but touching, welcoming George as the son he had always considered him to be. Lady Margaret's was surprisingly emotional, speaking of the joy of seeing true love triumph over convention. But it was Henry's speech that moved the assembly most deeply. He spoke of friendship tested and strengthened, of love that conquers pride, and of his certainty that no man could cherish his sister more thoroughly than George would. He admitted his own failings with remarkable candor, thanking George for his patience and Penelope for her courage in standing up to him. He concluded by raising his glass to the couple, declaring that some bonds were meant to be, and that he was honored to call George not just friend, but brother. As the newlyweds departed for George's estate in Kent, where they would begin their married life, Penelope turned back to wave at her family. Henry stood with their parents on the steps, and for the first time in memory, she saw tears in her brother's eyes. They were tears of joy, she knew, mixed perhaps with a touch of wistfulness for his own lost love, but predominantly happiness for her own fortune. The carriage rolled through the countryside as the sun began its descent, painting the landscape in shades of gold and rose. Inside, George held Penelope's hand in his, their fingers intertwined with a possession that no longer needed to be hidden. They spoke of their first meeting at Almack's, of the moment when everything changed. George admitted that his life had altered irrevocably that night, though he had not understood how or why at the time. Penelope confessed it had been the same for her, as though she had been sleeping her entire life and had suddenly awakened. When George asked if the fire that had awakened still burned, Penelope met his gaze with eyes that held promises of a lifetime together. Her answer was simple but profound, always and forever. As their carriage disappeared into the gathering twilight, those who had witnessed their story would speak of it for years to come. In drawing rooms and ballrooms across London, the tale would be told and retold, growing more romantic with each iteration. They would speak of the young woman who found her strength through love, of the man who risked everything for his heart's desire, and of the brother who learned that true protection sometimes means letting go. But most of all, they would speak of that first look across a crowded ballroom, that moment when two souls recognized each other despite all obstacles, all conventions, all rational thought. For in that glance was born a love that would inspire their children and their children's children, a testament to the truth that some fires, once lit, can never be extinguished. The years that followed proved the strength of their union. George and Penelope's marriage became one of those rare partnerships where passion and friendship existed in perfect harmony. They were blessed with 4 children, 2 boys who inherited their father's steady nature, and 2 girls who possessed their mother's ethereal beauty and hidden strength. Henry, true to his word, proved the most devoted of uncles. He never married, but rather than becoming a bitter bachelor, he evolved into a celebrated figure in Parliament and a beloved eccentric in society. He was known for his fierce loyalty to causes of justice and for spoiling his nieces with volumes of the most scandalous poetry and his nephews with the finest fencing instruction money could buy. In his library hung 2 portraits, one of Eleanor Fairfax as she had been in her youth, and one of Penelope on her wedding day. Both reminded him that love, whether lost or witnessed in others, was worth any sacrifice. He found his purpose not in his own romance, but in ensuring that the next generation would be both passionate and well-defended, free to choose their own paths without the burden of misguided protection. And so, another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society. In this case, it required courage from a young woman who refused to accept a life without passion, wisdom from a brother who learned to release his grip, and steadfastness from a man who would not abandon his heart's true desire. Their story stands as proof that some loves are written in the stars, waiting only for the right moment, perhaps a glance across a ballroom, to burst into flame.